Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I am delighted to welcome Ilham Ibrahim. You're most welcome. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
It's lovely to have you on. I think you're in Istanbul at the moment.
I am. Alhamdulillah. Thank you, first of all, for bringing me on to this podcast, Paul. I've been following Blogging Theology for some time, so it's a huge pleasure, alhamdulillah, to be able to contribute something.
Yes, well, your contributions, from what I've read so far, are really, really interesting, which is why I was desperate to have you on if you were to come on and do a podcast. So I'm very grateful you're here today. I'll just introduce you to a wider audience. So Ilham Ibrahim is a writer and researcher based in Istanbul, and she recently completed her MA in sociology from Ibn Khaldun University. Her research interests include sociology of religion and secularism, ethnography of the state, and anthropology of Islam. Her dissertation focused on religious and secular reforms during the post-colonial socialist periods of Somalia. Aside from her academic work, she is passionate about community work, traditional art, music, and poetry, and enjoys creative writing. But today, you're here, I think, mainly because you published a very significant paper titled Criminalizing the Caliphate, Transforming Remembrance into Resistance. I mean, that title alone blew me about, wow, this is such a controversial subject, and yet such an important subject. This is not just kind of, polemics. This is really important. And I'm so pleased, alhamdulillah, you are addressing this in this remarkable paper, which I will link to in the description below. So do have a look. So before I say any more, I will give it over to you. So what would you like to say by way of introduction?
Well, firstly, that was a very generous introduction, mashallah. I wouldn't say that it's an incredibly significant paper. I think it's building on what has already been produced by our teachers, our scholars, but I would definitely say that it has been inspired by the shift in the discourse when it comes to discussions of political formation in the Muslim world. I'm a millennial, so I have seen a lot of things just in my few decades of life in the Muslim world and just in the globe generally. So I'm hoping that, inshallah, what this paper can contribute something, and any of the good that comes from it is, of course, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And all of the bad and all of the mistakes is definitely from myself.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, you argue in your paper that, and I quote here, that the very act of remembering and indeed imagining the caliphate as a potential political configuration in the Muslim world has been and continues to be criminalized. Now, the criminalization of the caliphate. So I know you have kind of two stage response to this question in your paper. Could you perhaps take us through those two eras that you look at by way of answer to that question about how the discourse about the caliphate has been criminalized in our world?
Definitely. So I think a good place to start, Paul, is to just look at the term caliphate itself. The term itself has elicited such a visceral reaction, not just from Muslims, but just generally in the global political imagination. This term that has really, to some degree, been hijacked from us, but is an institution that has existed really from the time of the Prophet ﷺ after his blessed departure, and essentially all the way up until 1924, which is 100 years from now. So this image of like medieval barbarity that has been cultivated in the public imagination, what I intended to do with this paper essentially was to look at the idea of the caliphate from a different angle. I wanted to move away from the theological discussions and the creedal discussions because, for lack of better words, I like to stay in my lane when it comes to knowledge. I mostly look at things from the sociological perspective. But I'm looking at the term caliphate, I'm looking at it from the angle of criminalization. So I explore how this ummatic memory, how it has and continues to be criminalized. And particularly, I looked at two distinct post-caliphate periods. So the first period was the years after the abolition of the caliphate, or the years leading up to its abolition up until 1924, and then the subsequent rise of the Turkish Republic. And then I also look at the post-9/11 period amid the rise of relentless securitization of Muslim subjectivity, and of course, all of that under the guise of counterterrorism schemes. Essentially, the intersection of these two periods what I argue, it lays in these political and the social spaces where this idea of imagining the caliphate,
Mm.
remembering the caliphate, or even reformulating the caliphate has not only been criminalized, but I also point out how the Orientalism that has contributed to constructing it as an image of an unchanging, uniform, barbaric institution has incarcerated it, essentially historically incarcerated it to the degree that it's incapable of narrating itself into our present moment and into our future. So just to provoke your thoughts a little bit, I drew from a book, a really good book, Brian Massumi's Onto Power, to be kind of like the theoretical grounding of my paper. I want to kind of also in this conversation not be too theoretical. I feel like the conversation will be a lot more fruitful that way.
What was the book you were mentioning again?
Yeah, so the book that I used, Brian Massumi, his book is called Onto Power, Wars, Powers, and the State of Perception. It's a fantastic read. It's a bit dense, but it's a really good read. And I found it very relevant to this discussion. He quotes that fear is always a good reason to go politically conditional. And I want you to keep that in mind. And the listeners, I want them to keep that in mind as I continue to talk about some of the arguments in my paper. So basically, what is the problem? What is the predicament here? We have we live in a world that's essentially structured on the nation state model, right? And the apparent success of the nation state model as, the unequivocal standard of political organization in our world has drawn political analysts and pundits and all sorts to look towards the global south or the non-Western world. I don't want to just say the Muslim world, but like just generally the non-Western world, and wonder why the nation state has garnered such little success in non-Western societies. And we've heard all of the broken records, the platitudes of, oh, look, Muslim countries, they're horrible places. Wherever Islam goes, destruction is soon to follow. But aside from that very contemptuous finger pointing at Islam as the problem, many scholars, both Muslim and non-Muslim scholars, have explicitly shown that European colonization actually played a very critical role in systematically dismantling all forms of Islamic governance that is based on the Sharia and also customs local to the people there, and essentially reduced it to legislation of personal status, which was what
So in other words, to do a divorce and inheritance and all that. That's the extent of the Sharia, basically, in many Muslim majority countries.
Exactly. So beyond that sphere, beyond that realm, Islam has no place. Essentially, it was pushed out, decentered from that. So I guess the question is, okay, so what? Colonization. We're told constantly, colonization has ended, quote unquote, right? The nation state is it's part of our history. Muslims live in nation states. They have their countries. They're proud of their countries. It's here now and it's here to stay, right? It's this idea that because it is the only political experience that we've had, it can be the only experience that we can have, which is something that a lot of scholars have challenged. So I guess one example.
In your article, you do say this: the modern nation state is a product of European history in the 18th and 19th century, and it was something that it was universalized in their view, and as a result of colonization, it was something that was imposed on the Muslim world, famously after the First World War and so on, when the Brits, the French, and others redrew the map and created these statelets, these small little states. So it's not indigenous, it's not organic to Muslim world. It's something that was exported and claimed to be universal by the West. And when colonialism ended, as you say, the different forms of colonialism. There's the physical military colonialism where you occupy a country. Napoleon did famously, or the French in Algeria, Napoleon in Egypt, of course. But there's other forms of colonization today, which more to do with hegemony, this concept of hegemony, which is there both in Muslim discourse and in political discourse, with Gramsci, of course, famously the Italian political theorist as well. So it's a very powerful concept, hegemony. But anyway, I'm interrupting, but I just want to say, just stress, as you do in your paper, the European character of the nation state and how it's been exported through colonization and on a people that it was never a part of their history, never part of their memory of what it was to be a people.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, please feel free to interrupt. This is really adding to the conversation. In many non-Western societies, they are living a historical trajectory that was not of their own making,
Right.
right? They're living in they're not even just in a political sense. If we look at different ideologies that exist, like post-Enlightenment ideas, a lot of these that have become very pervasive and very much a part of the discourses and the institutions and the universities that exist on many different parts of the world. I'm not just speaking about the Muslim world, but
Yeah.
a lot non-Western societies in general. You'll see how there is a contention there. There is a tension that exists, and it's because it has not been something that was organically developed there. So another argument that I make in the paper is that while we have European nations, they've been experimenting with this collective European identity that's grounded in shared values through the formation of the EU and other transnational cooperatives. Parallel discussion of political unification or political cooperation in the Muslim world is often regarded as, look, Muslims, they just want another theocracy. They're hearkening for the good old medieval days, and this image is constantly casted upon the Muslim world when in reality they're not. The idea of having something similar to the EU, which has been proposed for the Muslim world, it's put in a different light as opposed to the Europeans who are progressive and moving forward and looking at different alternatives. But if you think about it in the Muslim world, it's because it challenges that hegemony that you spoke of.
Yeah, in your paper, you talk about this, the way that the European Union is something that is lauded and prized by many, but any idea of unification or unity amongst Muslims is not taken seriously at all. And you also talk about the influence of people like John Locke, the philosopher, this idea of tolerance because of the terrible wars of religion, the 30 Years' War, amongst many other conflicts where millions of Christians killed each other for centuries. And so secularism and liberalism and the nation state as we have it now is part of a solution to this European genocide that went on for a very long time. As a response to that. But in the Muslim world, that wasn't the Muslim experience. Under, say, the Ottoman Empire for centuries or other configurations, there was much more tolerance of diversity, of genuine pluralism. Christians could live in their own community and have their own autonomy to a considerable extent, ditto Jews as well and other groups. But this is this is something that is indigenous to Islam and the Muslim experience, but it's something the West have had to learn the hard way through genocidal wars for centuries, but now seeking to impose their solution on the rest of us, which is not welcome because it's not part of the Muslim experience. We don't need enforced secularism for Muslims is a European solution, not something that Muslims have had to learn that lesson. If you see what I mean.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. You articulated it perfectly. I also touched on this in my paper. This disenchantment with religion, if you think about it, these post-Enlightenment ideas that are really grounded on this disenchantment with religion, it only makes sense considering the historical trajectory that Europe had, right? And it makes sense that nation states and all of this political formations and the socio-cultural transformations, the ruptures, all of these things, it makes sense in a European context. However, what that has happened is that in a very Eurocentric way, in a very Western-centric way, this has been taken and universalized as a human experience, right? Rather than being a European experience. And by doing so, then you have these experiences or you have results of an experience that are being projected on a people who actually did not experience that. Right, this idea of this intolerance that you speak of this warring that had happened in Europe, that degree of religious intolerance never really existed in the Muslim world. And I mentioned this in my paper as well, that there was a degree of tolerance that was not only just a sociocultural reality, but there was legislative mechanisms, there was legislative institutions that allowed for this plurality to exist within the same space, right? It's known that the Jews and the Christians, the other religions that lived under certain Muslim empires, that they had the choice to rule under their own courts or they had the choice to rule under Muslim courts. This kind of tolerance, this kind of experience, being in the Muslim world, it only makes sense that there was a tolerance and a plurality that existed in the Muslim world. And obviously with Europe, that was their historical context, right? I'm not here to discuss whether it was right or wrong or the nuances of it, but it's reality. That's what their history was. But to universalize it is where we problematize that issue. We cannot universalize an experience that is not relevant to a people who did not experience it.
Yeah. And there's a marvelous quote in your paper, as I said, I've linked to in the description below. For example, you quote the German theorist Carl Schmitt, who's very much still studied today. And you say Carl Schmitt's rendition here is perhaps most well known. And then you quote him, quote, all significant conceptions of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, not only because of the historical development, which we've been discussing, in which they were transferred from theology to the theory of the state, whereby, for example, the omnipotent God became the omnipotent lawgiver, but also because of their systemic structures. And that's a very well-known quote, which I think is just brilliant, actually. That Schmitt was able to see that all significant conceptions of modern theory, this is Western political theory of the state, are secularized theological concepts. I thought, well, once the penny dropped when I read that, I thought, wow, that's very true.
Absolutely, absolutely, and to continue on that, to build on that point, this Eurocentric universalization of that experience, where there is this rupture between church and state, this rupture between society and religion, which essentially developed into the formation of what we see as the global world order today. Unfortunately, a lot of the discourse when it comes to being critical of what's happening in the Muslim world, the political analysts, they take for granted, essentially, they use the current political structure of today, the modern 2024 political structure that we have, and they use it as the standard upon which all other political formations are judged. And especially in the case of the historical caliphate, or any sort of modern day reimaginings of it, but it's very misleading to use the nation state as the pinnacle of human civilizational success, right? And then use that as the standard upon which all other political formations, whether they be modern conceptualizations or historical conceptualizations, using that as the standard to judge other formations. And there is a degree of, you would say, hubris and arrogance that comes with that, right?
Yeah, this idea of progress is characteristic of the West, and you see it in writers like great philosophers like Hegel, for example, and Kant. The idea in Hegel that the state, the nation state, Prussia in his case, was the summit of human progress, and that history is moving towards a goal where you have more and more freedom, more and more progress. And this is very not the Islamic view, of course, which is almost the opposite, that over time we move away from a higher to a lower state. Things are getting worse. And I think the Islamic conception, which is very unlike the European Enlightenment one, is much more realistic, because this is indeed the case. We're seeing this with global warming and other many other things. We're not really seeing progress except in certain particular areas, maybe in medical science, whatever, but overwhelmingly politically, geopolitically, and other factors, we're seeing great danger and great potential catastrophe, not progress at all. And so, yeah, that was just something that the different worldviews, so the way that Muslim and also traditional peoples outside of Islam also have a sense of the falling away of from a higher to a lower state. Things are getting worse rather than going up and up and up, like we do in Star Trek, where the bright future, there's no money, everyone's living happily together. Apart from the Klingons, but this kind of fantasy future is a projection of European imagination way into the sci-fi future, but it's not really realistic. I don't think it's not based on realities.
Definitely. I mean, Paul, you make a really good point about this term progress. Progress, I think, is a very problematic term, and as Muslims, I think a lot of Muslim scholars have been very critical of it, but I think we need to be more critical of it. And what does progress basically denotes? It denotes that you are moving away from something that was worse to something that is better, right? And this idea of human history and human existence moving in a linear fashion is a very it's very much rooted in, you could say, European thought, right? Karl Marx, for example, Marxist thought it's a very linear idea of human civilization. But if you look at Islamic traditions, if you look at what Islamic sociologists or Islamic thinkers and scholars, they, not even just in the Muslim world, but you can say in the non-Western world, human existence and human civilization is looked more in a cyclical manner. You know, Ibn Khaldun's theory of civilization, for example, it's a cyclical rise and fall. This idea of progress cannot exist in this cyclical model, right? Because you're not moving from what is worse to what is better. It is a constant birthing and dying of the experience. So I think even when and I talk about this in my paper, when we're discussing certain concepts in our religion and certain concepts that are related to, you know, the Muslim political situation or socio-cultural situation, it's really important that when we are looking at these concepts and we are discussing them, that we not only use a language that is relevant, that is actually from our tradition, but we also look at frameworks and models that are from our tradition as well, right? Language carries a worldview. Right, English is now the universal language, and this is something that is really it's unavoidable. However, there are certain terms like jihad that have been appropriated into the English lexicon, right? And they have been
Muslims themselves are using this, like the word jihadi now, which is meaning, it has no meaning, it's not an Islamic term at all. It's now part of our vocabulary, but it's a vocabulary that has been generated by non-Muslims to. For certain reasons, and other expressions I find very irritating when here in the UK, when recently government ministers were criticizing some pro-Palestinians who were using Arabic slogans, which are very, very mainstream in Islamic discourse. Allah Akbar, for example, which is a very spiritual, religious term which we all use in prayer and so on. And they criminalized that and they demonized it, and in a way that for them, these government ministers only meant terrorism, which of course is preposterous. It doesn't mean that at all. But that's how the term now culturally is perceived, and yet that's not. We're not defining it. Others who are hostile are defining it, and in a sense taking this away from us because we can't use it anymore without it being highly controversial.
Right. So. Exactly. Absolutely. You know, and this is kind of where it goes back to my paper when I'm talking about the term caliphate. So we have, of course, this memory of it that's left, right? We don't have a caliphate institutionally. It's been gone for 100 years. However, this expression, this term in and of itself has been taken and redefined in a context, in a framework that is not of our own making, but it was served to us, and we've taken it as Muslims, and we have a reaction to it. And this is kind of, you know, the modern human project induces this very peculiar sense of anxiety in everyone, and including Muslims. And Muslims in that anxiety, we've kind of retracted to a place of defense, right? So rather than engaging with our tradition and with our history from an organic lens, from a traditional lens, we are engaging with it through frameworks.
Can I just take the liberty then, beginning again, of just quoting from your paper? It quotes an extraordinary passage from Kemal, the leader of the first leader of the Turkish Republic. And what's what you say? Among the many reforms imposed on Ottoman society to sever the memory of Islam from public life, Kemal turned his immediate attention towards the institutional structure of the Caliphate. On October the 30th, 1992, you write, whilst presiding over the Turkish Assembly, Kemal and his deputies presented their initial draft proposal calling for the dethronement of the Ottoman dynasty. This proposition of separating the institution of the Sultanate from the Caliphate was the first step in subduing the political and religious authority of the Caliph. And in a second, this is my point, that Kemal, this quote you actually give, a shocking quote, but this is your preamble to this. Despite his efforts to silence all dissent, This proposal ignited heated debate between the Kemalists and the Committee of Sharia, who argue for the inseparability of the Sultanate from the Caliphate.
Mm.
Regardless of his efforts to appropriate religious discourse to justify his state-building ambitions, Mustafa Kemal soon set aside political conventions for a more hostile approach. That's putting it mildly. He mounted the podium. This is where it gets dramatic. He mounted the podium, swung his hand through as though he were carrying a sword, and pointed it at the neck of the influential scholar Mustafa Effendi, declaring, and here we have Mustafa Kemal saying this: sovereignty is acquired by force, by power, and by violence. This will be done at any price. If you all agree on this, it will be very appropriate from my point of view. Conversely, the reality will nevertheless be manifest in the necessary form. But in this event, it is possible that some heads will be chopped off. And this is no mere poetry, because he did. And then you say, after this quote, these infamous words were a mere glimpse at the politics of intimidation employed against all who invoke the primacy of the caliphate and its rightful place in the future of Ottoman society and the Muslim world. And I think Kemal's words there, you see, progress, which we mentioned, and modernity and westernization were often, or even usually, manifested through violence against people in the so-called, the non-Western world. And you see Kemal here using threatening, and he did use violence to actually destroy his enemies. And there, when I was in Istanbul, I heard some horrible stories of the way very noble scholars and imams were simply executed for refusing to, wear the right hat or to have the right views. And so it might be like the French Reign of Terror after the French Revolution, 1789. We had several years with Robespierre literally going around killing people, be they or aristocrats or ordinary folk, for having the wrong opinions. And this is like his reign of terror, it seems to me. For the same reason, to introduce secularism, to enforce westernized secularism, actually on the French model, because Kemal was quite keen on French secularism as well. So what I'm trying to say is liberalism, modernity, the nation state is often accompanied by extreme violence against people.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think what was really important for me when I was writing that part and researching that part is that I used the sources of Turkish scholars because there is this experience that the Turkish society has with regards to the Republican period and the effects of it. These discourses are still very active today, right? And I think one thing that period or that passage that you wrote, what it shows is that the exercise of violence is part and parcel of the architecture of the nation state. It is inherent, actually, I should say, to the nation state model. And essentially it's because the state possesses this godlike sovereignty, right? This God complex, this it's a self-deifying entity is what I argue. And without that, actually Halak argues in his book that without violence, that this sovereignty in the state, exactly, the impossible state.
Impossible State by Wallah Halak, Politics and Modernity is a Moral Predicament. I do recommend folks who haven't read this, absolutely seminal work. It's really important. But by the way, I've just got to read just one sentence from one of my favorite books, Islam as Political Religion, by Dr. Shabir Akhtar, who sadly passed away not too long ago. He's a philosopher at Oxford University. And it's just one sentence on page 150, which I've always liked. Islam's confession, there is no God except God, dethrones the state as God. Dethrones the state. That is the existential ontological threat, in a way, which is there because the state, as you rightly say, and you say the gold standard for secularism is France, where France, the French state is God. In that Carl Schmitz, it says that all significant concepts of modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts. So the state functions as a deity. And you dissent from the deity, well, you're going to be punished. And you mentioned all those, I think it's a law in 2020 in France, I forget the name of it, where numerous mosques have been shut down and imams have been kicked out. And in the name of this kind of sort of post 9/11 criminalization of
Mhm.
Muslim descent in this new quasi-theocratic system, i.e. France.
Absolutely, absolutely. Essentially, what it's operating as is that it is the supreme authority that is capable, not even capable, it is allowed to enact its will in a godlike manner with absolutely no sense of accountability, right? Whereas in Islamic models of governance, there is this hierarchy that exists where above the state there is God, right? The state is accountable to Allah. Whereas if the state takes on this God complex where it is not accountable to anyone but itself, that's when you see the most egregious acts of violence and crimes against humanity being committed in the name of whatever is needed to protect the personality and the hegemony of the state will do it, because it is the state that it's the longevity and protection of this personality and of this power of the state, this hegemony, that is of utmost importance, not having an accountability, a moral accountability to one that is higher than the state. And that becomes a very contentious issue for Muslims. Definitely, Muslim scholars have been discussing it because, as you said, if the statement in itself, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God, it directly brings that forward as a contention. And this is why I argue in my paper that the dominant world order that we have right now, Paul, it's not simply trying to mitigate the challenges posed by Muslim imagination or this idea or this framework, right? But in fact, nation states, they will continuously engage in an exercise of power that is rooted in a fear of the potential, right? So that means that no matter whether this threat or whatever this contentious entity is, whether it's actualized or not is irrelevant, essentially. But the state will always act against an indeterminate potential. It will always act against a defined enemy, essentially, or a defined threat in order to protect the personality of the state. And to be honest with you, this ummatic memory that I'm discussing in the paper, it is one of the few that actually poses the substantial challenge to this hegemony. And because of that, the nation state finds it's very contentious with this framework. And I think recent discussions in Muslim political discourse has actually been able to push forward into this discussion, because before it was slightly contentious and more emotional and emotive than it was nuanced and critical. But this is a very relevant point that you bring up, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a while ago when it finally dawned on me that this whole idea in Europe, in the West, between left and right, you think, oh, well, these are fundamental different visions of reality. The Marxist vision is so different from, say, the liberal vision and the conservative position, say, in the Conservative Party, the Republican Party in America. And it suddenly dawned on me one day that actually these are all variants on the same theme, the post-Enlightenment secular liberal theme. And you get conservative politicians saying, well, we believe in the liberal social order. I'm thinking, I thought you were conservative. No, that there's this transcendent social order above that, which is the liberal. So at the end of the day, Marx himself extended the Enlightenment project. This emphasis on materialism, on creating utopia on earth, this kind of very, very narrow, one-dimensional view of equality, which is basically kind of quite physical, materialist equality, rather than incorporating or acknowledging the spiritual domain, of course. But that's also very consistent on the same spectrum as liberal discourse or even conservative discourse. They're all using the same kind of paradigm, the secular liberal paradigm. So the only real alternative globally, as you say so well in your paper, is actually the Islamic paradigm. Why? Because it's based on it's a theocentric worldview. It's based on the acknowledging the sovereignty of God, actually, rather than our own material alleged that we can just create our own destiny, create our own natures. That this isn't the case. We are actually created by God, and so it's the only real alternative in the world now. Christianity having largely given up the ghost and become a species of secular humanism, and Judaism arguably having become Israelism, the kind of religion of Israel. And so what's left? We're left with Islam as the fundamental alternative, offering hope, not only in this life, but in the life to come. And so it's a great promise. It's a great message that Muslims have for humanity, actually. It's not just for Muslims, it's for everyone.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. And I think this is why these billion-dollar anti-Islam, Islamophobic industries are working so hard to continue to create this boogeyman image of Islam, and essentially, put Muslims in a position where their subjectivity is defined in a way that it can only be essentially, Muslims can only be defined as a potential menace to society, right? There's a definition of this boogeyman Islam. This has been funded by, fear mongering in mass media about mass migration from Muslim majority countries, extremism, terrorism. All of this has been actively producing this aversion to Islam, because the reality is that Islam addresses a lot of the ailments that modernity has and postmodernity have brought forward to us. Paul, we live in a post-truth world right now. We live in a world that does not even accept this idea that there is a truth. The only truth that exists is my truth, right? Which, in other words, it's basically the only truth that exists is what my nafs is guiding me to do. Everyone has a God. You just decide which God it is. You cannot say, I don't have a God. Either your God is your nafs, your God is, another religion, but you are guided by something. It is in our nature as human beings. And with this post-truth, there's this dismissal and this disregard for fundamental truths of human experience and human existence, right? And fundamental parts of human society that have existed for time immemorial, really. And one of them is hierarchy. Since we're talking about the state here, one of them is hierarchy. There's this doing away with hierarchy. I don't have to answer to anyone. I don't have to, speak anything except what is considered my truth. But in Islam, we have this understanding of hierarchy. It exists. There's a hierarchy of knowledge. There's a hierarchy in the family. The children must obey the parents. We are taught that the scholars, for example, they are the inheritors of the Prophet Muhammad SAW. So the scholars, people of knowledge, they have a hierarchy above those who do not know. This is very clear in the Quran. So hierarchy exists in our tradition, and hierarchy is necessary in the human in human condition, in human experience as well. But the post-truth world wants to do away with anything that has even a semblance of objective morality or a semblance of God, simply because that doesn't serve its purpose. It doesn't serve its purpose, because if there is an objective truth, if there is an objective morality, if there is a God which you are accountable for, then you have to answer for what you do. So
and although I agree with you, but I think there's a paradox here, because there is a pushback on to what you've said from the same sources. So even though on the one hand, postmodernity, our age doesn't recognize absolute truth, a transcendent narrative, it rejects modernity in the older Enlightenment sense of a kind of universal reason, everything is my truth, your truth, whatever. But at the same time, our zeitgeist also promotes or sort of requires adherence to certain truths which are absolute and unchallengeable. But hang on, haven't we just said that my truth is my truth? Yes, but so, for example, the LGBT thing is in many, many places unassailable, unchallengeable. You can't question so-called gay marriage now, or you're out. That's it. You're not a respectable person anymore. That's true in France. Also, I've noticed in many, many places, like in France, a so-called woman's right to choose based on a radical moral autonomy, where owns her body, and this has been incorporated into the Constitution of the Republic of France. This is recently move. So it's an absolute truth. It's no longer my truth. So I can't say, well, I believe it. I believe actually abortion, except in very rare cases, is wrong because it's no. You can't say that. No, that's going against fundamental human rights in this instance. So there's this is bizarre, uneasy juxtaposition between radical, multiple autonomies of truths, relative truths, on the other hand, with absolutes when it comes to abortion or gay marriage, and increasingly so when it comes to certain principles to do with what's going on in the Middle East, without going down that rabbit hole, that you can't dissent from them because they are seen as required fundamental facts of truth. You challenge the narrative, you will be punished. And people have been. And you talked about the criminalization of the caliphate. It's also the criminalization of dissent on other issues as well in the West.
Oh, definitely, yeah. And I would even contend and say that it is the appropriation of absolute truths. But the fundamental axiomatic principles that underlie those truths are entirely from the nafs. They are entirely subjective. They have no objective, they have no sense of objective morality or any of that.
Yeah, I just wanted to also, in your article, you could talk about these two epochs, the period from 1924 with the Turkish destruction of the Caliphate, and then there's another epoch, another period. This is the post 9/11 period, where there's another criminalization of the Caliphate. How does that instantiate itself in our experience? Because this is the period we live in now, of course. How does the criminalization of the Caliphate work, and is it through legislation? Is it through the media? What's going on there to criminalize this language, this aspiration to Muslim self-rule in a way?
Right, absolutely. So I think I want to go back to the first quote that I had mentioned in the beginning of our discussion, which was from Brian Masumi's book. He said that fear is always a good reason to go political. And this is probably the fundamental argument that I'm using for this idea that the caliphate has been, but also continues to be criminalized. And I say that because this idea of what Masumi argues in his book essentially is this idea of preemption. I'm just going to give a little bit of sort of grounding here, and then I'll answer to that question. He speaks about this idea of preemption, which essentially is get them before they get you, right? And he says that this is the operative logic of power that has emerged as the defining political logic of our time, especially in the post 9/11 period. So in that way, what I look at in both periods, they are defined by this fear of a future potentiality in which Muslims are the sole writers of their own destiny. So in the post-Caliphate abolition, the 1924 period, you can see how there was overt legislation by the Turkish state to essentially erase any remnants of the old Ottoman polity or any sense of religion from the state. A very clear rupturing that was done, a very violent rupturing that was done. But in a post-Caliphate period, all we have is a memory of the Caliphate, right? We don't actually have an institution. So what I'm arguing is that the Caliphate as an ummatic memory, and by extension, the imagination that comes with that memory, it has to be defined by the powers who have defined it as a threat or a challenge to the state, essentially. So as I mentioned, one example, how we see it is the mass fear-mongering with mass migration and terrorism and all of this stuff. This has pervaded public life where Muslim subjectivity essentially can only exist in a defined it can only exist in a certain definition, right? Being Muslim now can only exist in a certain definition, and that definition is incapable of defining itself, right? So this hostility towards Muslims, this hostility towards Islam has essentially contributed, as I argue, to this fear of an indetectable enemy or an indetectable threat, right? And what's really interesting is that given the construction of this threat to the state, right, of this indeterminate potential, we have, this mass migration to Europe, and I think, Paul, you know this much better than I do as a European. The discourses of these masses of these hordes of migrants are coming, and there's terrorists within them, and there's sleeper cells in Europe, and all of these things. Essentially, this threat now that has been constructed by the state, it is unbound by conventional battle frontiers. Right. So then Masumi says something very, very potent in his book. He says that the most effective way to fight an unspecified threat is to actively contribute in producing it. So then what can be said about today is that as Muslims, we live in a time where we're trying to navigate a political era in which expressions of Islam or even Muslimness, Salman Saeed describes this idea of Muslimness as things that have been associated with Muslims, i.e. like a beard or a turban, but not necessarily directly related to Islam. And that's why, unfortunately, there have been non-Muslims as well who have been targets of Islamic hatred and Islamophobia, because these stereotypes have been generated by this colonial propaganda machinery, right, of what Islam is, and this boogeyman of Islam and this boogeyman of Muslims. This has been constructed in such a way that these expressions of Islam or these expressions of Muslimness pose an existential threat and therefore necessitates emergency procedures. Essentially, get them before they get you. The preemptive logic. Get them before they get you. And this is why you can see this really come out in the form of counterterrorism schemes and securitization of Muslims by virtue of having a Muslim name, by virtue of having a certain nationality, by virtue of, even participating in certain Islamic precepts or certain Islamic rituals, you are automatically classed within a security threat, essentially.
And I noticed this because I the last couple of years I've been very blessed and fortunate enough to travel a lot, fly basically, and quite often I do travel with other people, and I've learned there's some experience, and it's very difficult for white guys and women in the West to really appreciate this. But I know there's some experience repeatedly, and it's always going to happen. It's just the way it is at the moment, anyway. And that is to take, for example, when I went to California, San Francisco, with a colleague slash friend, on beating, and we knew what would happen. I would go through passport control, San Francisco airport, like the speed of light. I barely had time to draw breath before I was through. And I knew the three questions I'd be asked. How did I know? Because the guy in front of me was asked the questions. So I said, bum, 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 boom, I was through.
Yeah.
And I also knew, with the predictability of night following day, that my friend who had the name Mohammed, who was not white, would be asked lots of questions. And he was. And it's happened all over the world, wherever. And it's not just a Western guy, it's Muslim countries. Egypt, for example, and Turkey, etc. And I've often been with friends, and I've had to wait hours when I've gone through. I've been straight through passport control. Had to wait outside for hours until they come out. They do come out eventually.
Yeah.
But it's just a huge pain for them. And but this is the racial profiling and the Muslim profiling that is just routine, and it's not just white people doing it. It's brown people, officials in non-Western countries also doing exactly the same thing to the people with the same background as them. But nevertheless, they're all doing it. And you've got to experience it to believe it. It really happens. And it happens all the time. And it's a joke. We joke about it now because it's so ridiculous. We just know what's going to happen. And, I have white privilege by the virtue of the fact, I have a British passport and my name and everything. It doesn't trigger anything, even though if they saw half my videos, they realize that, but other people don't have that privilege, and they are scrutinized and questioned by simple virtue of the color or their name.
It is a very relevant point, and I appreciate you sharing that and recognizing that the standard exists. I don't travel very often, if I'm honest, but the times that I do travel, every single time I have my hands swiped for what I would assume would be some sort of bomb residue or something, or drugs, or I always have my hands tested. And at this point, I just put my bags through and I just stand there and I give them my hands because I know what I'm anticipating at this point. So this is truly it's unfortunate, but this is the reality, where it's simply a profile that is given to me. If I maybe didn't wear the scarf, I don't know if that would change. My name is fairly Muslim, so I feel like that would probably still, but I'm a Canadian citizen. I hold a Canadian passport, so that standard exists, unfortunately. But it is this idea, as I mentioned, of preemption, of anticipatory fear, as I argue in my paper, this fear of the potential. Let's just get it before it gets us. Let's securitize it. Let's define it. Let's put it in a box in which, by defining it, we can contain it, and therefore we have power over it. So this is why I guess I argue that the state, which actively produces this threat, let's say, and as I mentioned, like what Brian Masumi had said, that the most effective way to fight an unsuspecting threat is to actively produce it. The state, therefore, wields the power to define this challenge or this threat as it pleases. And so, in other words, this threat doesn't even need to exist for the state to act against it. And then, therefore, you see Muslims in our time right now, coming to the answer of your question, we are stripped of the autonomy and the agency really to narrate a present or a future for ourselves outside of this given definition, right? So I think this is where my contention with the paper was, my contention with this term caliphate. Why I was problematizing our imagination of it is because the very definition of it, the very language that surrounds it, has been defined for us. And I guess this is why what prompted me in this in writing this paper was actually a question I asked myself. And I think even for the viewers, it's worth asking ourselves if what informs our imagination of the caliphate, right? Is it really, or you can not even just the caliphate, any terms or concepts or institutions from our tradition, is what informs it actually of our own imaginings, or was it something that was constructed for us? And this begins by questioning this internalized and often very invisible structures that confine our ummatic memory and our ummatic experience within the constructs that we are trying so hard to break free from, whether it be a secular liberal construct or whatever it may be. And this is why language is so important.
And also, I think, well, books are very important, and I'm going to take the liberty now of recommending some books. But nearly all of them, by the way, you quote from in your essay. This one, for example, "Recalling the Caliphate: Decolonization and World Order" by S. Sayed, who you quote from, professor of decolonial thought and social theory at University of Leeds. It's a very interesting book. Great cover, of course. Relevant to that, and this is another one of my favorites by Professor Joseph Kaminsky, "Islam, Liberalism and Ontology: A Critical Reevaluation." This is a superb theoretical work looking at Islam and the West. You want to learn about John Locke and all the Western theorists and the Islamic alternative. It's a critical reevaluation. So he's not just saying, oh, well, he criticizes those who say, well, liberalism and Islam are all basically compatible and so on. He's quite, he drills down to the key definitions there. I really recommend that book as well. You quote from that, of course. "Longing for the Lost Caliphate, a Trans-Regional History," Mona Hassan. Again, longing for the lost caliphate. Again, articulating this sense of loss. A fantastic book. And here's a book you didn't mention, but I'm very keen on. "The Inevitable Caliphate: A History of the Struggle for Global Islamic Union, 1924 to the Present," by Reza Pankhurst. He's a British historian. It's got rave reviews from academics, very senior academics at the LSE and Durham University and so on. This is a great history of the caliphate and the different pro-caliphate movements that have emerged since 1924, whether it be the Muslim Brotherhood or Hizb ut-Tahrir or whatever, and what's their differences and what their agendas are in a very positive way. And he sees the caliphate as the normative Sunni project. There's supposed to be a caliphate. It's not just a nice idea. It's actually part of what it is to be Muslim in terms of political action. And this is one of my favorite. I've already mentioned Islam. You didn't mention this one. Islam as political religion, the future of an imperial faith, an unashamed and unabashed articulation of Islam as a political religion. Controversial. He said to me, because he was a good friend of mine, Shabir, sadly passed away now, that this book had not been reviewed. It had been ignored by the mainstream press, even though the man was a genius, an outstanding work. And you mentioned this book, which is one of my favorites as well, "The Impossible State," of course, is always worth reading. And you quote from him, it's got the distinguished book, the Columbia University Press Distinguished Book Award, and it is a seminal work. You've got to read this if you want to have be a part of the contemporary discussion of what it is to talk about the Sharia, Islamic governance in our world. Do we just Islamicize the nation state as Muslims? The clear no. That's an impossibility, literally impossibility. Anyway, those are some of the ones. Are there any key works that you recommend to us to read as well?
I would definitely recommend from the book that I just recently quoted. You also mentioned Dr. Salman Said, "A Fundamental Fear." I think this is actually a very it's a brilliant book when he's talking about this idea of essentially being, right, as Muslims, and this idea of the fear and the definitions of fear that have been attached to what it means to be a Muslim. You mentioned, Professor Kaminsky's book. This is a fantastic book. I work with Professor Kaminsky, and he's a great scholar. Absolutely.
Yeah, he is. Yeah.
Definitely. In terms of I would say, in terms of because I did my thesis on the sociology of secularism, religion, and we touched on secularism, Talal Assad's works on secularism would be, yeah, I'm sure you have it.
Yeah, I forgot. There we are. Do you mean this one? Formations of the Secular, Christianity, Islam, Modernity, Talal Assad, who was Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at the University of New York. This is another key text, if you haven't read it. I don't mean you, but I mean, if you haven't read it, yeah, absolutely. I agree. That should be on our reading list as well.
Definitely. It can be a bit dense and academic, but
Very.
going through it, it's really I think a necessary read if you want to understand alternative understandings to secularism, which, you know, for me in my thesis, Talal Assad's books were essentially my main theoretical framework that I used, and it's because it is so potent to understanding how the formation of secularism has sort of formed in the Muslim world, and this typical notion that we have, this conventional notion of secularism basically being the separation of state and religion. It doesn't really work in the Muslim world. So by looking at it through an alternative lens, which is what Talal Assad does, it really was an eye opener. So highly recommend for sure.
Yeah, and I guess if people are completely new to this, one has to recommend Edward Said's book Orientalism, the kind of Bible of post-colonial studies. But it has been quite profoundly critiqued by Wal Halak in his book Restating Orientalism. I'm just looking at Column, I got it over in A Critique of Modern Knowledge. So this is actually with epistemology, really. It's how we understand the world around us. And that is a profound critique of Edward Said, or an extension of really pushing it further and exploiting some of the assumptions in, I would say, Edward Said's work. But nevertheless, Said's work, Orientalism, which is very easily available online, is, I think, still fundamental reading, nevertheless.
Absolutely agree. Definitely. And I think one of the final arguments that I make in the paper is this idea of deorientalizing our notions, and to understand what deorientalizing means, definitely Said would be necessary to understand. But essentially, you know,
Edward Said is a brilliant. Said was a brilliant writer in terms of his prose. I mean, it's actually exquisitely fantastic writer. He wrote lyrical prose. Unlike, bless him, and I've said this before, so if you ever he'll probably know this, Wal Halak doesn't write wonderful prose. So it's not like an aesthetic pleasure reading Wal Halak. Well, it is, I think, for many people reading Edward Said. Now, that's not to comment on the content. The content, of course, is a different matter, but it's a real pleasure reading Said, particularly if you like good books, well-written books, if you like literature. It is a pleasure to read, as well as to be stimulated and educated by the content.
Absolutely agree.
Well, okay, good. Well, perhaps we might conclude there. I think, as I've said several times, the link to the paper is in the description below. Criminalizing the Caliphate, Transforming Remembrance into Resistance. This is such a provocative title, and yet it really is a necessary title, I think. And for me, just to compare it with a political revolutionary slogan on the left. So there's a party in Britain called, this is almost random, the Socialist Worker Party. They're a proclaimed revolutionary socialist Marxist party. They're small but quite influential, pretty much outsized. They have a lot of influence, very pro-Palestinian. They're always talking about how we must protect Muslims, they campaign against Islamophobia. So they do some good stuff, but never, ever in their many online journals and their websites, in their rhetoric and their discourse, do they ever take Islam seriously as Islam? Because they're a Marxist organization, they're atheists. And so they'll say lots of nice things about Muslims, how we need to protect Muslims in their views, but they never ever engage with those views. It's almost like they're holding their nose and saying, we'll protect you and we'll campaign for you, but we're not actually going to take anything you say seriously at all. Yeah. And it's this kind of thing, wow, that's kind of really odd. You know, you don't say anything about Islam, but you bang on about Muslims all the time. It's really kind of odd way of kind of, oh, I really respect you, but I'm not going to listen to anything you say. Why? Why don't you actually engage with the people you are so loudly campaigning for and seeking to protect? We welcome your protection, but it's a bit more to us than just, you know, fragile people who need protecting. We actually have a purpose, a meaning. We have a message, and that's never ever acknowledged. And that for me is an Orientalist thing, where oh well, we must protect the vulnerable, whatever, the immigrants. Not that I'm an immigrant, but we're never actually going to take you seriously as a human being because why should we? That's kind of Orientalist kind of superiority complex, I guess.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. I would even go as far to say it's this type of savior complex, right?
Yeah.
This idea, it's like, oh, you can't speak for yourself. Let me speak for you. It essentially comes from this European colonial enterprise. Like, this is why, Paul, you make a really good point, and I implore anyone who's a viewer here to take the study of their religion, to take the study of these ideas, to take the study of whether it's sociology or political science, take it seriously, because the voices that we need are the voices that need to come from us, not voices that are imploring, on our behalf, because they will not, like you said, a perfect example, they will, be our allies or things of that sort. And they will say,
Muslim, we love Muslims, take Muslims. We're never going to do anything you say because we don't want to hear.
Exactly. But they will never stand up for the fundamental principles that we hold dear as the axiomatic truths upon which we stand as Muslims. So they will be pro-Palestinian. There will be many overlaps between our political causes. But when it comes to what we were talking about, these absolute truths, this needs to be grounded, and this needs to come from us as Muslims. And this is why, especially for the younger generation of Muslims who are aspiring scholars and things of that sort, I implore them to really take this study seriously. I'm not somebody who, alhamdulillah, I just completed my master's, but I wouldn't consider myself academic or intellectual in any regard, especially because I actually don't even have a social science background. I'm actually a nurse by profession, and then I went into sociology.
Your paper was very academic.
Thank you.
Outstanding work, and I don't know why you put yourself down like that. I thought it was outstanding, and I do wish you continued success in academia, a PhD and beyond. I really hope you further your career in that, because your voice is so clear and just needed. It's just needed. You really have touched on a nerve there in your latest paper, and doubtless you've written other things, but which just needs to be heard. We need more voices like this to articulate these issues mainly about the caliphate, and having our own voice rather than others speak for us in this kind of very inadequate way, like the revolutionary socialists or others. No, we need, because they're not going to represent us ever, because they just don't obviously agree with us. So we need to have our voice, and you are articulating a powerful voice. So all strength to your voice. Please continue your work. Please continue with your academic studies, inshallah. And we'll look forward to that.
Inshallah. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, thank you very much for coming on Blogging Theology today. And I'd say do look at the paper in the link below, Criminalizing the Caliphate, Transforming Remembrance into Resistance. An important paper. So thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Until next time.
Jazakallah khair. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.